since you're kind of introing the order anyway, I'll just follow whatever.
I think if that works for you,
totally fine.
I thought maybe like if you want to take like a minute or two to also introduce yourself at the beginning and talk a little bit about like your connection to all of this material and your background a little bit. I think that'd be interesting for people. Okay. All right, friends. So I will invite people to finish grabbing their drinks and their food. We're going to start in 1 minute. Okay. So why don't we go ahead and get started? This room feels very, very frontal in this presentation today, but maybe I'll ask quickly, let the people in the hallway know that we're starting, so that because there's some noise coming from the hallway. All right, so now we will get started. It's wonderful to see everyone today. Sorry, this room is pretty, it's pretty reverberant. So okay, perfect, thank you all. It's so nice to see everyone, so nice to be together. I hope everybody had a lovely Hanukkah and is perhaps looking forward to a few quieter weeks coming up soon. Rabbi Blake is away this weekend. He's in Washington, D.C. The Union for Reform Judaism is hosting a large movement-wide gathering in Washington, D.C. It's not like the biennials of old where you would have, 5,000 Reform Jews in a room, but trying to kind of restart the idea of gathering as a movement now post-COVID. And so Rabbi Blake is representing our congregation at that gathering. And it's really a pleasure for Oren and me to have the opportunity to be here today for session 5 of the History of Zionism class. I don't know if Rabbi Blake mentioned, I think there is going now to be a session 6 because he said he didn't quite get through the material. So I know, and I haven't been sitting in on the class, but that this class has you've had the opportunity to have conversations about the philosophies of a lot of the Zionist thinkers over the years. And so that's really important and helpful foundational knowledge and background to have. I think to complement the learnings about the Zionist thinkers, it's important to think not only about these ideologies and these philosophies, but how it is that then you try to ingrain those ideologies and philosophies into the minds and into the hearts of the people who are building this new nation. And as we all know, music is really one of the primary ways in which we help to bring people along into the values and the ideals that we strive for as a people. And so to understand sort of in more practical terms what it really looked like to be a people trying to build a state based on these Zionist ideologies that you've been learning about, we thought it would be interesting today to give us a window into the history of Zionism through music. So there are going to be 2 parts to what we're doing today. The first is we're going to go through the 5 Zionist ideologies that you've talked about in your classes with Rabbi Blake. So those are political Zionism, labor Zionism, revisionist Zionism, cultural Zionism, and religious Zionism. And we'll have a quick refresher of what each of those are. And we'll talk about musically how that actually has played out through the history of the State of Israel. And Then at the end, we're actually going to take an opportunity to talk about how events in Israel, how wars and different challenging times throughout the history of the country have caused people to start to question or think about how those different philosophies really apply in their lives. So we'll talk about these 5 different ideologies, and then we'll talk about sort of how Israelis have challenged and rethought those ideologies over the years. So I think I know everybody. I'm Cantor Amanda Kleinman. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. But we're joined today by a really amazing special guest. We're very, very lucky to have Oren Nyman here with us today. You may know Oren, you probably know Oren because he has been at WRT for decades as both a musician and at different times as a teacher in what used to be the religious school and what is now the JLL. And Oren, in addition to just being a wonderful musician himself, is really a scholar of this music and brings both his own personal life experience and just a broad wealth of scholarly knowledge around this to us today. And so I wanted to just give Oren a second to introduce himself and talk a little bit about his connection to this topic and this music.
Hey, everybody. So glad to be here. As Cantor Kleinman said, my name is Oren. I have been here in various capacities for many years at this point. So you may recognize my face even if we haven't spoken before. And in terms of my kind of personal story and connection to this material, I was born in Israel. I can put on an Israeli accent if we want this to be more authentic, but I think it'll probably be better if I don't. Actually born, and I grew up in a small town in the north of Israel in what's called the Jezreel Valley, or Emek Israel in Hebrew, which was really an area where a lot of this Zionist ideology kind of manifested in many of the small agricultural towns and kibbutzim that I grew up in. And when we're talking about songs that are particularly associated with that part of the country, I'll say more about that. But also as a musician, and even more particularly when I moved to this country and kind of started writing and creating music, a lot of what influences me is a lot of different Israeli music throughout the decades, and it's kind of, for me, been a reason of a lot of inquiry into what is Israeli music? Is there such a thing, Israeli music? If so, what makes it Israeli? So these are a lot of topics that I've spent a good amount of time researching and thinking about.
We're very lucky to have you with us today, adding your depth of knowledge to our conversation today. So, and please feel free to, I know that this format makes it a little harder for things to feel participatory, but please feel free to just raise a hand and jump in. We really want this to feel interactive and want everyone to feel like you have an opportunity to both question and comment throughout our discussion. I hope that when you came in, you saw, and if you didn't, maybe you'll run and grab, there's a packet that says song lyrics on the top. We want to make sure everybody has all the lyrics for the music that we're going to be looking at today, and there are more copies on the table right outside this room. So, as I mentioned before, and Rabbi Blake shared his class materials with me, you talked about 5 different philosophies or 5 different ideologies of Zionism. So we're going to go through each of those 5 and talk about how those have played out in the history of the country through music. So the first Zionist ideology that you talked about was political Zionism, right? As probably most notably exemplified by Herzl. Right? And this is really just the idea that Jews must live as a sovereign people in their own land, if you were to sort of just distill it down into one sentence. And we know that there were some questions that came along with that. For example, for a time, there was a question of, did that land need to be Israel, or could that be a different land, right? So not all the details were necessarily ironed out at the time, but the idea that political sovereignty for the Jewish people is something that was, essential to us as a people. And I think to get us started today, the song that I think is best associated with this form of political Zionism is probably Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, right? We're not going to play Hatikva today. We've all heard Hatikva before. You can see, though, that the song lyrics are on the first page of your song lyrics packet. But we're actually going to talk about Hatikva is a very interesting choice of national anthem for Israel, and a very interesting case study because there is a lot that's not exactly right about having Hatikva be the national anthem of Israel. The text of Hatikva comes from a poem that was called Tikvatenu, which means our hope. It was written by Naftali Hertz Imber in the 1870s. Imber was from Galicia. And he started by writing a shorter poem, and then he had an opportunity to visit what was then Palestine himself, and he was then moved to expand the poem to nine stanzas. I'll ask this again in a few minutes, but can anybody think of reasons why Hatikva shouldn't be Israel's national anthem? Is what?
The second line in the other page, the Jewish soul still yearns because Israel is a country that's open to all religions, but I don't agree that it's wrong.
Right. Okay. So it recognizes the Jewish character of Israel, but doesn't necessarily recognize other peoples living in the land of Israel as well. Okay. Any other thoughts, Steve? Right? Okay, so this is a yearning for what could be instead of a celebration of what is, right? And it's really interesting. We chose a text that was written in the 1870s and not something that was written actually for the founding of the state of Israel. So it's a song of yearning instead of a song of celebration of sovereignty. That's great. Anyone else? All right, the other ones are, yeah.
2,000 years? Does it go back longer than that?
Does what? Yeah, it's a good question. So some of the other pieces of this have to do with the melody for Hatikva, which is very interesting. So Hatikva does not come from some sort of original Jewish melody. This is a borrowed melody. The earliest version of the melody that we can find, although it may date back further than this, is from the early 17th century, from an Italian song that's called Fuji Fuji. I'm going to play it for you so that you can hear it. But what you'll hear is a melody with a theme that will actually repeat itself throughout European music for decades. So I'm going to play this for you. This is an Italian song from the early 17th century called Fuji Fuji da questo cielo.
Fuggi, fuggi, fuggi da questo cielo aspro e duro, spietato cielo. Fuggi, fuggi, fuggi da questo cielo aspro e duro, spietato cielo. Tu che tutto in prigione leghi, neve il pianto ti frangio, pieghi, fier ti diranno, cederanno. Fuggi, fuggi, fuggi da dove il verno sulle brine asseggio eterno. Vieni, vieni Candida, vien Vermiglia, tu del mondo sei maraviglia. Vieni, vieni Candida, vien Vermiglia, tu del mondo sei maraviglia. Tu nemica d'amare noi e dona l'anima delle gioie. Me ne saggerà pre primavera, tu sei dell'anno la giovinezza, tu del mondo sei la vaghezza.
But you probably heard this recurring theme of do 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 Kolod balev of penima Fuji, Fuji, Fuji da questa cielo, right? So this is the earliest version that we have. It was actually most well known as a late 19th century Bohemian tone poem called Die Moldau. I'm not a good German speaker, but you can look that up on YouTube as well. So the melody is actually not a Jewish melody. It's also kind of a sad melody, right? It's the melody is a melody of yearning as well. And if you look at the text, it is not a text that is it's not a biblical text. It's not a text that necessarily draws us back to something in our Jewish past that we can connect to easily. Yes, it draws us back to the idea of yearning, right? This yearning that we've done for thousands of years. But we don't see, references to biblical ideas or stories or prayers. So it's a really interesting choice of anthem for Israel. And actually, it didn't become the Zionist national anthem until the early 1930s. And I don't know if anybody can guess what year Hatikva became the official national anthem of Israel. I don't know if anybody knows. 2004. Yeah. So Hatikva did not. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that
please.
I think that this is just it's not something that I've researched, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was like many other things in the founding moments. It was just a choice of haste and like, oh, everybody knows this song. Let's just I would totally believe that that's the way the discussion happened. And I mean, the truth is even in that, and there are stories throughout the decades of conversations being had of what song might replace it as an anthem. Probably the most well-known example of that is when Naomi Shemer wrote Jerusalem of Gold. It became such a popular song that there were conversations where it was brought up that maybe that should become the national anthem, which she was not in favor of.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Jim.
If that's the case, so why did my 1965 World Book state that Hatikva was the anthem of Israel?
It was it was the de facto anthem of Israel, but was not the official anthem. And that was actually for multiple reasons. Partially the reasons that we've discussed, right? This idea of like, oh, well, I'm sure we'll come up with something better or something that makes more sense for us later. But part of it also was exactly what Jim brought up before, this idea that that Hatikva did not necessarily represent all of the peoples who live in the land of Israel. And so perhaps it was not necessarily an appropriate anthem in that regard. And that was another actually part of the debate and part of the conversation as well. And, I don't know, I tend to think of it sort of like Kol Nidre. You may or may not know, Kol Nidre was a very controversial Jewish text that actually was taken out of Yom Kippur services in a number of communities for a number of years because the whole idea that that Jews once a year would be nullifying any of their future promises over the coming year is something that people were always afraid would, become a basis for anti-Semitism, though they weren't necessarily calling it anti-Semitism at the time. And so, there were a number of rabbis really kind of like throughout the Middle Ages and beyond who wanted to take Kol Nidre out of the service, but people were just so attached to it and so attached to the melody in particular that it stuck around, and we still have Kol Nidre in our services now. And so sometimes I think about Hatikva as sort of an example of that in certain ways. So that was the example of political Zionism that we wanted to talk a little bit about. And it's, again, I think there is more opportunity for purity in written philosophy. And when you get into music, is when things start to get a little bit messier because you're talking about what it is that's touching people's hearts. And so I think that's why it's really interesting to start with an example like Hatikva.
Yeah, actually, now that you're saying it, the Hatikva story really, it's an interesting similarity to the Herzl thing of like, he wasn't necessarily married to the state of Israel as the place. and it was really more an understanding that that is the only place where he could convince, particularly Jews of Eastern Europe and Russia, to go to, and that is when it kind of crystallized as an idea. So it is kind of similar.
So the second philosophy of Zionism that you spoke about with Rabbi Blake was the philosophy of labor Zionism. Some of the thinkers that you talked a lot about A.D. Gordon, who was the founder of this idea of labor Zionism, the idea that Jewish sovereignty would emerge through the idea of working on the land, right? So there was a centrality to the land and a centrality of the role of the Jewish people in cultivating and in building up that land. There's another thinker that I don't know if you spoke about with Rabbi Blake named Max Nordau. The reason I bring up Max Nordau is because he coined this idea of the new Jew. He was born in Hungary and was a physician and became very involved in later Zionist congresses. But he believed in this idea that Jews of old had been weak and frail and pale looking, from living in these crowded ghettos, and that the new Jew was somebody who was spending a lot of time outside and working the fields and, getting a wonderful tan and growing muscles. And you, I think, cannot underestimate the importance of this ideology and philosophy in the establishment of the state of Israel. Helene, I saw you were about to say something. I don't know if there was anything you were going to add there, but no, okay. And if you think about the idea of the kibbutz movement, it was based in huge part on this idea of labor Zionism and this idea of the new Jew. And so there's a song that we'd like to share with all of you that's called Shir HaEmek. It's a really, really, really beautiful song. You won't get to hear quite as much of the beauty of it, actually, because of the way in which I'm going to show it to you and the context in which it was written. If you ever hear us do it at services, you'll hear it a little bit differently. You'll see. Yeah.
I queued up one more version.
Okay, great. So we can listen to both parts.
Of.
Okay, good. You can see the text on the second half of the first page. And I think it goes on to the top of the second page as well. Mm-hmm. So this song was written in 1935, or it was released first in 1935. I don't know if it was written sooner than that, but and it was written by Natan Alterman and Daniel Sambursky. I don't know if you want to say anything about them, but
well, Alterman is kind of one of the foremost poets of kind of pre-Israel, very much of the establishment, very much writing in service of Zionism. There's a lot of poetry of his that became both songs and kind of seminal, kind of canonical poetry that's used in various ceremonial functions in Israel to this day. And Daniel Sambursky was kind of one of a generation of composers that, to me, kind of created the DNA of Israeli music. And they were composers that were kind of very intentionally, most of them Eastern European, coming over to again, pre-Israel Palestine, and consciously, with all this Zionist ideology in mind, trying to create a style of music that is definitively Israeli and not kind of their Eastern European background, even though, of course, their Eastern European background ends up coming with them. But they're also very, very, they do kind of serious study, and they're very influenced by both the local music that they hear amongst Arabs and Bedouins, and also very much by the all three of them, and many. Three. I'm thinking of three that are main in my mind, which is Sambursky and Mordechai Zeira and Yedidia Admon. There were others, but they were all also very influenced by the music of the Yemenite Jews. So more Yemenite Jews came later, but kind of the first bunch of Yemenite Jews that came over with the first Aliyot. So even in the late 1800s, there are Yemenite Jews that come to Israel. And the Eastern European Jews really saw their version of Jewish practice as kind of the most authentic because of lack of influence from anywhere else. And therefore, these composers were very, very interested and kind of would go and find Yemenites who knew a lot of the traditional music and just study it and kind of incorporate that influence into their music.
So I'd love to just read for all of you the lyrics to this song, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the context in which it was written, and we're gonna watch a video of it together. The weary came to rest and finish their labors. Pale night covers the fields of the Jezreel Valley. Dew underneath and moonlight above, from Beit Alpha to Nahalal. Oh, what a night of nights, silence over Jezreel. Sleep, dear valley, land of glorious beauty. We will guard you. The sea of grain is swaying. The song of the flocks rings out. This is my country and her fields. This is the Jezreel Valley. Bless my country, reveler, from Beit Alpha to Nahalal. Mount Gilboa is darkened. A horse gallops from shadow to shadow. A voice is carried high. Over the fields of the Jezreel Valley. Who is shot? Who has fallen between Beit Alpha and Nahalal? So this song was written in the mid-1930s, actually specifically for a movie. And the movie was called L'chaim Chadashim, which actually means like to a new life, but is translated often as Land of Promise. It's a film about the pioneers of Israel, and it was produced by the Karen Hayasod, which is now known sort of as the United Israel Appeal. And you'll see that I'm not going to say much about the imagery of what is in this video and what is in this movie. You'll see exactly how they're trying to enforce these ideals of labor Zionism in the way that they created the song and the video together. But what I will tell you is this is actually some rare footage that was posted on YouTube. The final stanza of the song we read says, who is shot, who has fallen between Beit Alpha and Nahalal. So they made the video with the full song, and then the producers of the video decided that they actually did not want to include the last stanza. They felt like that was going to be demoralizing and not necessarily going to build that enthusiasm and solidarity that they were looking to build by including that last stanza. And so for the original release of the film, that last stanza was taken out. And this is some rare footage that actually includes that last stanza. So I'm going to show you, this is a clip from the movie where they sing the song in the movie.
It says the dining room in Givat Brenner, which is a kibbutz. That's actually the composer.
Oh, it is? This clip is about 5 minutes long, just so you know.
מתנועע, שיר העדר מצלצל, זוהי הציונותיה, זהו עמק יזרעאל, תבורך ארצי ביתי טלל, מבית אלפא עד נהלל. דממה לילה מליל, דממה בישראל, נאמר עמק ארץ תפארת, אנו לך משמרת.
זוהי ארצי ושדותיה, זהו עמק יזרעאל, תבורך ארצי ותתהלל, מבית אלפא עד נהלל.
דממה לילה מליל, דממה ביזרעאל, נו מה העמק ארץ תפארת, אנו לך משמרת.
טל מלמטה ולבנה מעל, מבית אלפא עד נהלל.
דממה לילה מליל, דממה בישראל, נו מה עמק ארץ תפארת, אנו לך משמרת. תמדי בשקט!
No, I think it's just a movie that they made.
I do think that the scene in the kibbutz, a dining hall. I mean, I don't know, but that I would believe is just the real dining hall.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, yes, right. Yes, yes. Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point too, right? These don't all just fit into one neat category. Yes, you're absolutely right. So tell me what you observe in terms of the way the song has been put together with the video to try to, make a certain impression on you. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's a great observation, right? So there's sort of a secular, right? There's sort of a secularism to it. Yeah. Yeah. Right. You're right.
Also,
Yeah.
the other thing to your point that I think is interesting is that this is kind of the way of life that was spoken about the most. In reality, percentage-wise, the amount of people that were in the moshavim and the kibbutzim was
like 10% of the
much
country
smaller
at its
than-
peak, I think,
than
right?
urban
Yeah.
than people who ended up in urban environments.
Yeah. The other thing that you noticed at the beginning, they start in the kibbutz dining room all singing together. There was a concept in early Israel that has continued to some extent since then, called Shira B'tzibor, which means communal singing. And it was the idea on kibbutzim, but also just like sometimes in town squares and in, a lot of different places that people would come together just to sing the foundational building block songs of Israel. And that was sort of a culture building effort to have everybody coming together to sing songs together that reflect their shared values. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And one, yeah, go ahead.
It was, I mean, for those composers who kind of were doing this type of work at the time, I mean, probably really everywhere in the world at the time, but certainly in Israel, that was the way to get this, to see if a song is gonna become part of the canon. You would go to a kibbutz and play it in the dining hall and see if it catches on, So that in that sense, that scene is very authentic. That is really the way they got their songs out there, you know. And the communal singing, the Shira B'Tzibur, is still something that people, I mean, whether it's that generation or like my dad's generation in Israel, it's still something that very much happens. That and the folk dancing thing, which kind of went, those two things were kind of created together at the same time, and they are still very big. Like it's. Yeah, right, and that comes straight out of that for sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and you see, you know, to Oren's point earlier that people who lived on kibbutzim made up a pretty small percentage of Israel's population throughout its history, but had a very outsized, were a very outsized proportion of, for example, officers in the army, and so while this was a small group in Israel's history, it had a very outsized sort of influence. The other thing that I think is interesting is that the video doesn't just have everybody singing together in the dining hall, but shows people singing these songs while doing everyday tasks. And I think that creating that association for people, like that these are the values that we want to guide you when you're shaving, when you're, you know, when you're milking a cow, right? Like we want these to you know, permeate every part of your life. Yeah, please. And they all look really healthy. That's right. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about your personal connection to this?
Well, I was going to say, I was actually, so this is the valley that I grew up in. You know, Na'alal, that's spoken about in this song, that's where I went to high school. And it is, you know, like Cantor Kleinman was saying, in terms of kind of both the army generals, you know, Moshe Dayan came from Na'alal. Many kind of particularly of those generations, but even to this day, it's an environment that is very much steeped in this ideology, and also on the other hand, because I think it's so formative, and because these kind of composers and other artists also came and brought this music, there's also kind of very many of the really important poets and singers also came from those environments. So, for example, Yonatan Geffen, who was one of Israel's formative poets, died in the last few years, was also from Na'alal. So I remember, you know, for me, if I look at this song, what it makes me think of is, like, for example, on Shavuot every year there was this big celebration in Na'alal, and it didn't look like that, but it didn't look very far from that either, you know. Mm-hmm. And you know, everybody would gather, and there would be tractors and bales of hay and horses, and it was this kind of celebration of what, to this day, of kind of what was idealized in those movements. It's so the Emek Yizrael, the Jezreel Valley, is kind of, it's north but not like super north. So if you think about Haifa, you go inland a little bit, it's kind of between Haifa and the Kinneret, kind of smack dab in the middle. The place, really, the place in the valley that people who come to visit Israel see most is Nazareth, which is completely in that neighborhood. Yeah.
Two things. I mean, I find it interesting that a song that's about Zionism is so focused on just one valley, and also even though they removed that last verse, the idea that you need to be guarded at night is still very much a part of it.
Yes.
Yeah, I will say that, you know, it's interesting that when facing the West, they would cut something like that out. But for the people living there at the time, a lot of these songs were very real about that. I mean, there was no covering up that was part of daily life also. The only other thing I'll say, just on a musical, yeah, right, of course. The only thing I'll say, just on just wearing my musician hat, is that the melody here is a good, to me, a really good example of this kind of attempt. Daniel Szymborski was a German Jew, and writing a melody like this with the kind of syncopation that's in there is an attempt of creating music that has Western harmony in it, but that kind of Middle Eastern syncopation. So I'll just give you, the song, if this is the tempo. So the song the song the way he wrote it is da 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 dee da doo dee da, or in the chorus da dee da da doo da doo da da dee da da ba da ba da. If this was like, in more kind of European style of that time, it would be da 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 da, as opposed to da 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 da. That syncopation is very much an attempt to like merge those two styles of music and create something new. And I think it was something new.
This is why Oren's awesome, for many reasons. Did you want to show the other clip, or should we?
I can't. Yeah. So if so, the other clip that I kind of queued up of this melody is actually a dear friend of mine who is a wonderful and very busy bass player and composer in Israel. Who we, childhood friends. We grew up together. So he did this instrumental version of the song that was then reworked for a whole ensemble. But what I think is interesting in just hearing the melody is that it allows you to kind of focus on that thing that I was just talking about. Yeah, so even in that very classical setting, you can still hear that syncopation there. And so, I don't know, I just thought it was a nice example where you could really focus on the music.
Yeah. Like I was saying before, when you watch the original video, you actually don't realize how beautiful the song is because they're just like yelling it in the dining hall, which is the point. But it's really a beautiful melody. So we've talked a little bit about political Zionism. We've talked a little bit about labor Zionism. We'd like to shift gears now and talk about revisionist Zionism. This was, I think the main thinker that you spoke about here was Zev Jabotinsky, who lived from 1880 to 1940, who was born in Odessa. And Jabotinsky's Zionist philosophy was a sort of revision of mainstream Zionism, with the idea that the approach to Zionism so far had been a gradual approach to acquiring land and to building on it, and Jabotinsky thought that approach was perhaps too passive, and so he really promoted the importance of Jewish self-defense and building armies that would help the Jewish people, further their Zionist goals and build the state of Israel. So he did a lot of work, organizing self-defense units in Europe, and then also, of course, was an important military figure in Palestine as well. He died before the founding of the state of Israel. He also founded the youth movement Beitar, which was designed to sort of physically train the youth of Europe. And so we can really see the influence of revisionist Zionism through what were called the army bands. So we know there are army bands in the United States as well. In Israel, army bands are like a totally different thing, and they were hugely fundamental to building Israel's musical culture, particularly in the first 3.5 decades or so of the nation's founding. But it was a big deal to be in an army band, and like the best new songs were coming out through the army bands. And so this sort of like centralization of musical culture around what was happening in the army, I think, is a very good demonstration of this kind of revisionist Zionism. And there's a song that we're gonna to talk about with you, and that we're gonna play for you, that Oren can talk a little bit about.
This is the Shir Leut, right?
Yeah.
So this
On page 2, by the way.
So yeah, this song is called Shir Leut. You can say song of friendship, of camaraderie, and it was written by a poet named Chaim Guri, and music composed by Sasha Argov. So this is kind of, I spoke before about these kind of composers who created the DNA of what Israeli music is. This is kind of the next generation. Sasha Argov is very much influenced by those composers, but also a formative kind of composer in his own right, and one of the main important composers in Israel in the 50s and 60s. Shir Leut was a song that was written by Chaim Guri in 1948, in the winter of 1948, so about a year into the War of Independence, and very much kind of with the war going on on his mind. So particularly, if you can see, I mean, we can look at all the lyrics, but that second stanza where he says, "Time goes on, do we notice at all how the months have gone by one? Time goes on, there are a few of us left, and so many we once knew are gone." So it's interesting that in the translation they didn't, he specifically says a year has passed. So he was really marking the time that he was writing the song rather than just time goes on in general. But in that war, the losses were so massive that those who survived were really kind of dealing in a very tangible way with the level of loss. So that's kind of the first thing that strikes me when I look at the lyrics. But then the chorus is really what became kind of a formative, repeated trope, if you will, which is okay, so they are gone from our midst, all their laughter, their youth, and their splendor. This is a little bit of a poetic translation, but I'll give you kind of a direct translation if I can. So in Hebrew it says, "Ach niskor et kulam et yefei hablorit ve'atoar." So we'll remember them all with it talks about the blorit, which is like this kind of comb-over hairstyle that was like of the time. But like basically these beautiful guys. And this type of friendship we will never be able to forget, or this type of camaraderie. So I think that line is probably the most recognized and repeated line, and it's, this song is part of Memorial Day in Israel every year, all over the country, on the radio, in ceremonies. It was also really well known as Yitzhak Rabin's favorite song. So it's something that he spoke of many times throughout his life. It's not just something that just came up after he was murdered. And he was, so this song was really written before the IDF was the IDF. It was, there were kind of different factions, the main one of which was the Palmach. And Yitzhak Rabin was one of the Palmach generals in the War of Independence. So I think that, the song obviously had a very personal resonance for him. Should we listen?
Sure. And one thing I'll also point out, by the way, as we're listening, is I think it's important to note that even in the songs of the army bands, that people are grappling with what it means to serve and what it means to experience that immense sort of loss, right? And often you would expect that an army song would be much more celebratory, and some of them were, but the army and the army bands didn't shy away from that grappling as well. And by the way, like sometimes they crossed a line into what sort of the higher ups felt like had gone too far. And so there were certain songs that, and I'm trying to think of an example of one that came out and then immediately were pulled back.
Probably the best is Shir LaShalom.
Shir LaShalom. I thought it was Shir LaShalom, and I couldn't, right? So Shir LaShalom was an army band song, right? And if you think about that and what it became associated with later on, it was performed and then sort of immediately pulled back. And so the way in which the army bands sort of grapple with the real emotions that come along with everybody in the country serving in its army is really interesting to notice. So I'll play the song now. I apologize because the ad. Yeah, of course. Please.
So no, interestingly enough, there were women in the army in Israel. Well, actually, in the War of Independence, there were women in the service. Just, I think, really by virtue of the fact that they just needed anybody who was willing to do any type of service. Yeah?
Right. I mean, think about Hannah Senish, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, so it did. I actually never heard that specific, but it makes total sense. But yeah, so women were involved from the beginning. It is true that after 48, there's kind of a good gap of 40 years before the discussion of women returning to combat positions. Right. Yeah. But then in the 90s again, so women always served, but it was more in kind of office positions and that type of stuff. And then in the 90s, the conversation kind of came back of women being allowed into combat positions, and now it's actually fairly common.
Okay, so here's the song. I apologize for the ad that has 3 more seconds left to go. All right. Okay.
And this is an army band performing. One of the army bands. It's Shir Hareut.
So start at the bottom of page, or the middle of page 2, and continue through the middle of page 3.
And notice just in terms of kind of the setup of the army bands, it's mainly singers and acoustic instruments, guitars, maybe a flute. And I think that that was just a very practical choice that, you know, during a lot of these, particularly during the military operations, these guys could all fit into one Jeep, go to a little fort with 10 people, do a performance, move on to the next one. You know, you didn't need any kind of backline. It was just, that's literally what it looked like when they came to perform. And that allowed them to just go from place to place to many, many different small locations and do performances.
Anything else on this? So we have 2 other Zionist philosophies we're going to be talking about today. I'm guessing we're not going to get to the songs at the end, but we'll see. The next one is cultural Zionism. And this is the philosophy of, really kind of Achad Ha'am is the best known thinker who wrote about cultural Zionism. Cultural Zionism is the idea that in order to fully realize ourselves as a nation and as a people, we need to fully realize every aspect of Jewish culture. So music, literature, art, poetry, theater, and that shared culture should be based on the shared history and the shared religious texts and the shared calendar of our people, but in a cultural way more so than in a religious way. So, it's the idea, for example, that on Yom Kippur in Israel, there are no cars on the street, but that's not because everybody's at synagogue. A lot of people are not at synagogue, right? A lot of people are riding their bikes out in the street, or, kids on scooters out in the street. But the idea is that we still are building our culture based on our shared history and our shared holidays, regardless of the fact that a large portion of the country is secular, and doesn't necessarily observe Judaism in a religious sense in that kind of way. I
was going to say similarly about that. I think another thing that's unique and comes out a lot in Israeli music is there are many songs that have biblical references or text references, and we'll probably point out a few in some of the songs that we get to. But I think part of that is because when you're in high school or middle school in Israel, you study Tanakh. It's just one of those subjects that you study. Now, what's interesting is that it's studied, but not from a religious standpoint. It's more kind of a literary take on it. So, in Tanakh class, you learn the stories, you analyze them, but it's really from a literary perspective. It's like analyzing, Shakespeare or anything like that. And what that creates, though, is this kind of shared cultural knowledge that someone can write a song referencing a biblical character, and everybody's going to know what the person is talking about.
Maybe just for fun, I will play the other one. But you talk about the songs that you were gonna.
So right. So when Cantor Kleinman said cultural Zionism, to me, the first thing that I think of that's really interesting, again with those kind of early composers, that I thought of is holiday music. So holiday music. So there are many of these composers that I was talking about earlier that just wrote holiday songs, but really with this kind of very anti-20th century composer concept of like, if you did a good job writing a holiday song, no one's going to know that you wrote it. Right, because the purpose is you want to hear the song and be like, oh yeah, this is a holiday song. We've been singing this song for hundreds of years. So it's always a subject that I find interesting because, I'll have sometimes discussions even with friends who are Israelis and musicians and should know this stuff. And they're like, no, that's, some traditional Yemenite song. No, actually it was written by, the one that I'm thinking about, for example, is this song Shoshanat Yaakov, which is a Purim song, and which everybody thinks is a folk song, but it was written by this composer named Yedidia Admon. He was a Ukrainian Jew. A lot of people think this is, like I've heard from several people, that this is a traditional Yemenite melody. It's not. So, you know, there are many different versions of it, but I'll just play one quick. And these are all very short because they're holiday songs and meant to be short. Why is this not?
Okay, hold on. It's weird that happened. Okay, let's go back.
Yeah, try that one.
שושנת יעקב צהלה ושמחה לראותם יחד תכלת מרדכי שושנת יעקב צהלה ושמחה לראותם יחד תכלת מרדכי תשועתם הייתה לנצח תקוותם בכל דור ודור ברוך מרדכי היהודי ברוך מרדכי היהודי.
So that is a Purim song. And I'll play one other example.
I think it's,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to mention just one thing, which you can see sort of some shared themes between some of these religious texts and Zionist ideals. So in the Purim song we just listened to, the second stanza, the words are Teshuatam Hayita Lanetzach Tikvatam Bechol Dor Vador Baruch Mordechai Yehudi. So like it's basically like our salvation will be eternal and their hope will be in every generation, right? So that's a theme that relates to the holiday of Purim and the salvation of the Jewish people from Haman's plot to kill the Jews, but it's also a theme that like really resonates in a Zionist capacity as well. This idea of tikvatam, right? Hatikva, the hope enduring throughout the generations. And so I think a big piece of the formation of cultural Zionism was taking these inspirational ideas from biblical stories and then applying them to us now as, you know, modern Jews who have once again found sovereignty in our land.
So this other one is a song called Banu Choshech Legaresh. It's probably my personal favorite Hanukkah song. Maybe try the top one.
Okay.
Yeah.
באנו חושך לגרש, בידינו אור ואש, כל אחד הוא אור קטן, וכולנו אור איתן, סורה חושך על השחור, סורה מפני האור, סורה חושך על השחור, סורה מפני האור. חושך לגרש, בידינו אור ואש, כל אחד הוא אור קטן, וכולנו אור איתן, סורה חושך על השחור, סורה מפני האור, סורה חושך על השחור, סורה מפני האור.
What's that? So this one is a Hanukkah song. I'll just do a quick translation of the lyrics. So, Banu Choshech Legaresh, we came to extinguish the darkness. We have light and fire. Everyone is a little light, and all of us together are a powerful light. Get out darkness, move on, go away, or like Sula. Yeah. Run away from the light, essentially. So this kind of concept of expelling darkness, and again, a song that in Israel is a very well-known, very well-loved Hanukkah song, and one that people think was just around there forever. But no, it was written. In this case, even the lyrics were written by a woman named Sarah Levi Tanai, who was actually a kindergarten teacher, but also wrote many of these, or choreographed many well-known folk dances. And so again, just this idea of kind of creating a new culture, even, and again, if it's most successful, it's supposed to feel like it's been around forever. And I can say when I moved here, it was a surprise to me that all the holiday songs I grew up with are not known here. I assumed that everybody knows them.
And I'll point out again, when you think about Hanukkah and the Maccabees and extinguishing the darkness, right? Like those are ideals that are very transferable over to Zionism as well. And I think it's important to notice which of the holidays are the ones that we're writing all the songs about, right? Purim and Hanukkah, and not one of the examples that we've
Not just festivals, but festivals whose story is a military victory.
Right. And another one is that there are a lot of Israeli songs for Tu B'Shvat, the holiday of the trees. Again, when we talk about celebrating the land, right? We don't see, with a few exceptions, like a whole lot of these sort of Israeli cultural songs being written about Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av or Passover necessarily, right? And again, with a few exceptions, but we see in the vein of cultural Zionism, because also like these holidays about which the greatest number of songs are being written in the early years of Israel turn out to be actually the most minor holidays on the Jewish calendar, but the holidays whose stories help us to reinforce the values that we want to reinforce in building our nation together, right? I'm gonna play just for fun, and then we have one other song to talk about together. I'm gonna play one more that I think is just a very fun example of cultural Zionism, and you can see it's at the bottom of page 3. It's called Ya'aleh V'Yavo. Ya'aleh V'Yavo is very specifically a text that we recite as part of the Jewish holidays. This is an adaptation of that text. You can see the way that the singer is doing it, but it's like a biblical quiz. So it's making these references to stories in the Bible, and you can see in the footnotes on pages 3 and 4 which stories they are. And you're supposed to, as you hear the song, try to guess what biblical story it's hinting at, but in a totally sort of non-religious pop music kind of way. And this song is a lot of fun, and it's reminiscent of what do they call the Bible competition?
Chidon HaTanach.
Yeah. There's you can tell a little bit about the Bible contest.
There's this it's called Chidon HaTanach Ha'artzi, the National Bible Quiz. And it still happens to this day every year. It's a national competition that people send students to, and I think it is, it used to be more prominent than it is today, but it does still happen.
And it's this idea that everybody, even in the secular schools, are really fully learning Bible, right? And so this kind of a song, people might get the references and might be able to guess at it. So.
יעלה ויבוא, יעלה ויבוא, יעלה על הר נבו זה האיש אשר יראנה, ואליה לא יבוא, יעלה ויבוא, יעלה ויבוא,
It just makes you smile to hear somebody like reciting these traditional words, like looking like one of the Beatles or something. Yeah. we'll stop that one right there, just because it's a fun example. But you can go home and I put in the footnotes what each of the different stanzas are a reference to, so you can go up and catch up on some of your obscure biblical references in the context of a very mainstream Israeli song.
And just to connect with what we were talking about before, so that singer, his name is Gidi Gov. This is the early 70s, I would say 72 or 73. He was fresh out of one of the prominent army bands. And that was already, it was really, the army bands until the end of the 70s were a launching pad for your career. Like, I'm talking, imagine like Bruce Springsteen in an army band. That's Gidi Gov. Totally. Did people do that as their service? Yeah. Yes, that was their service. But you knew if you wanted to be a musician or a singer, that was the way to be in. Like if you were in one of those army bands, the biggest singers that came out of the 70s in Israel were all army band people, all, like without exception. So the Leonard Cohen story is a little bit of a separate story. We can, but yeah, it was not an army band, even though it was like a casual forming of something like an army band. Well, yeah, but it wasn't in any official capacity.
Within 90 minutes of Newburgh, you could.
Right, but it was. Well, I can't tell the whole story, but yeah.
Were any of our Israeli musician friends here in army bands?
None of us were in army bands, although my friend Gilad, the bass player, who I just played a clip of, was in an army band. The army bands in the early 80s were severely budget cut. So, if in the 70s, if you were a guitar player and you wanted to have a career in music in Israel, the army bands was the way to do it, and there were many positions. So, you would go and you would audition. And the auditions still exist these days, but there may be like 2 positions. So, Idan's dad, however, was a singer in
Really?
one of the prominent army bands.
Idan Santos, who plays the flute here on Friday nights.
Yeah.
So
Ask him about that.
So there's one more Zionist philosophy that we're talking about today, one more that you talked about with Rabbi Blake, and that's the philosophy of religious Zionism. This is the ideology that was really made famous by Rav Kook, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of British Mandatory Palestine. And his philosophy was a reaction to the more mainstream religious idea that Jewish people should not be proactive in establishing sovereignty in the land of Israel, that should be something that is initiated by God and is part of a messianic era. And that dates all the way back to, there's a text in the Talmud that says that the nations of the world promised not to oppress the Jews excessively, and the Jews promised not to enter the land of Israel by force. So you can actually see that in the land of Israel today, there are a number of ultra-Orthodox communities that are actually anti-Zionist. They live in the land of Israel, but they do not believe in the idea that the Jewish people should establish sovereignty there. So it's a really interesting tension. And so Rav Kook and those who followed him reacted against that philosophy, saying that really we should be channeling the efforts of the Zionists and the early pioneers of Israel, and really we should be channeling their energy to ensure that the land of Israel doesn't lose its sacred Jewish character, right? So Rav Kook was very supportive of early Zionist efforts, but like really made a lot of efforts to say, but don't forget, what it means to be Jewish. And particularly in the past couple of decades, there's been a sort of like revival of this religious Zionist music. And so we're going to play to conclude today one example of that by a contemporary artist whose name is Yonatan Razel. He writes a lot of really beautiful music, and a lot of what he writes are actually word-for-word settings of Jewish texts and prayers. But this one is actually an adaptation on page 5 called Zion. And you can see the first few words in Hebrew are Ki mitzion teitzeh. And what that comes from is if you think about the Torah service, when we take the Torah out of the ark, we sing Ki mitzion teitzeh Torah, which means for from Zion comes forth the Torah. And so this song, he writes from Zion comes forth, and then he writes an interpretive stanza based on those first few words of that liturgical text. And so this is a beautiful example, I think, of a creative and interpretive religious Zionist text. And this is going to be the last song that we're going to listen to today after the advertisement. Okay. But you can see he, is wearing his velvet yarmulke.
שחיכינו לה 2000 שנה בארץ רחוקה, כי מציון תצא ההבנה, יפה שלמה טהורה, אשר שמענו אותה בפעם הראשונה בארץ רחוקה. מספרת על השקט, על האדם, לוקחת אל כל המקומות הטובים שבעולם, לוקחת אותי, אותך ובכלל, כי מאדם יוצא דבר אלוקים, מוכר ש...
Really quickly. So at the top, by the way, this says Festival Gush Etzion. Okay, so Gush Etzion is a settlement outside of Jerusalem. Okay, and that, by the way, is a really important part of the religious Zionist philosophy and ideology, is the idea of continuing to settle the land. And as we all know, this has been an extremely contentious issue, right? The idea of these settlements, and so he's performing at this festival in Gush Etzion, in this settlement.
ששמענו אותו בפעם הראשונה בארץ רחוקה, כי מציון אצא אל העולם, יפים מחוזקים ביחד, כמו שעמדנו שם בפעם הראשונה בארץ רחוקה, ונדע אז כולנו נגודל חזרה למה כל זה קרה, ולמה זה היה כל כך ארוך, הנה ערב, יום שביעי.
The last line is Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker, Yom HaShvi. There was evening and there was morning, the seventh day. Right?
יפה שלמה נעימה, שאנחנו מחכים לה 61 שנה בארץ קרובה, מציון תצא תורה ודבר השם לירושלים, הללויה. מציון תצא תורה ודבר השם לירושלים, הללויה. לה 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 תצא תורה ודבר השם לירושלים, הללויה.
I'll say again, he writes really, really, really beautiful music. I would encourage you to listen to some of his other music. But it's also really interesting to note, by the way, I don't know if you noticed that. So they're playing in Gush Etzion, and he's wearing his black velvet yarmulke, and I think he's the only one wearing a yarmulke in the whole orchestra.
In the orchestra?
Yeah. So, which is really, which is just like it's interesting to see. So. Yeah, the kids are.
Well,
right.
I mean, is a really interesting thing with these few singers who kind of come out of this movement that have had wide mainstream success, and it's something that they really kind of struggle with straddling both worlds, because on one hand, like Cantor Kleinman said, he's clearly a super gifted musician and a great singer, and people recognize that in the secular part of the country as well. On the other hand, as a singer of his background, what do you do if you're at a concert and there are women in the concert and they're dancing? And so there have been all kinds of, over the years, kind of different media scandals around him grappling with and really trying to figure out what that balance means for him. There was a scenario where he put black tape over his eyes in a performance so that if women are dancing, he wouldn't see it. All these strange, it's just really interesting to think about someone from that background trying to maintain that background, but also have a popular music career.
Yeah, it is. Any other? Well, I know that you've been, deep into your studies of Zionism with Rabbi Blake, and I wanted to just thank all of you for spending this time with us today. I'm a little bit biased, of course, but I am a very strong believer that you can't understand a nation and its character and its people without understanding its music. So I think that this is an integral part of understanding the history of Zionism. I hope that it's been interesting and a little bit enlightening for all of you. And thank you to Oren for joining us. This is amazing to have you. So
Thank you.
Yeah, do a sermon and song. Okay, I was actually just thinking about that. So thank you. I'll